My daughter's imaginary friend warned us about the real kidnapper. Mira started talking to Captain Whisper 3 days after her 5th birthday, when she announced during breakfast that her new friend said we should never open the door when the mail comes at strange times. My wife Julia laughed and asked what Captain Whisper looked like, playing along with what we assumed was normal childhood imagination. Mira described him as tall and quiet, with eyes that saw everything and a voice that sounded like wind through cracks. She said he lived in the spaces between things and only talked to her when something important needed to be said. I smiled and returned to my coffee, thinking nothing of an imaginative kindergartner developing elaborate fantasy companions. Children her age often created detailed imaginary worlds, and Mira had always been creative with stories and make-believe scenarios. Captain Whisper seemed like a harmless addition to her imaginative play, possibly inspired by books or shows about mysterious heroes. What struck me as odd was the specific nature of his warning about mail delivery times, but I dismissed it as random child logic. The warnings continued with increasing specificity over the following week. Captain Whisper told Mira that the blue car with the dent in the door was a bad car and we should remember its license plate. He said the man who smiled too much at the grocery store was pretending and we should never talk to him alone. He mentioned that someone was taking pictures of our house when we weren't looking and that we should check for footprints under Mira's bedroom window after it rained. Each warning was delivered matter-of-factly during dinner conversations or car rides, with Mira treating them as simple messages she was passing along from her invisible friend. Julia and I exchanged concerned glances, wondering if Mira was developing anxiety or if something at school had frightened her. The warnings seemed too detailed and specific for normal imaginary play, but we couldn't identify any obvious source of fear in her daily life. Mira remained cheerful and energetic, showing no signs of distress except when relaying Captain Whisper's increasingly urgent messages. I started documenting the warnings in a notebook, initially planning to show them to Mira's pediatrician during her next checkup. The list grew disturbing as patterns emerged. Captain Whisper consistently warned about specific vehicles, particular individuals, and locations around our neighborhood. He mentioned that someone watched our house between midnight and 2 in the morning on weekends. He described the smell of cigarettes near our back fence and said we should look for cigarette butts in the bushes. He warned that the nice lady who walked her dog past our house every evening was writing things down in a small notebook. He told Mira that someone had been in our garage when we were at church on Sunday morning and had touched things without moving them, obviously. Each detail was precise and factual rather than fantastical, which made the imaginary friend phenomenon increasingly unsettling. When I checked the bushes near our back fence, I found 3 cigarette butts that hadn't been there during my previous yard work session. Julia suggested we consult a child psychologist about the imaginary friend's unusual characteristics. Dr. Helena Vance specialized in childhood development and behavioral issues, and she agreed to meet with our family for an evaluation session. During the appointment, Mira drew pictures while Dr. Vance asked gentle questions about Captain Whisper and his messages. Mira explained that Captain Whisper wasn't like regular imaginary friends who played games and had adventures. He was more like a guardian who noticed things other people missed and warned about dangers before they happened. She said he could see in the dark and move through walls and knew when people were lying, because their voices changed in ways most people couldn't hear. Dr. Vance watched Mira carefully, noting her calm demeanor and the detailed consistency of her descriptions. After the session, Dr. Vance pulled Julia and me aside privately. This doesn't present as a typical imaginary companion. The specificity and consistency suggest Mira might be processing real observations through the framework of an imaginary friend. Children sometimes create protective figures to help them communicate fears they don't fully understand. The implications of Dr. Vance's assessment were chilling. If Captain Whisper's warnings were based on Mira's actual observations rather than pure fantasy, then someone was surveilling our family with professional-level attention to detail. I contacted the police non-emergency line and explained the situation, feeling foolish as I described my daughter's imaginary friend's warnings. The officer who took the report was patient but skeptical, suggesting we install security cameras if we felt concerned about neighborhood activity. He took notes about the cigarette butts, the blue car, and the other specific details Mira had mentioned. but I could tell he thought I was an overprotective father with an imaginative child. He advised me to document any suspicious activity and call immediately if anything concrete happened. The conversation left me frustrated and uncertain, caught between dismissing Mira's warnings as childhood fantasy and taking them seriously as legitimate security concerns. I installed motion-activated cameras around our property that evening, mounting them to cover all entrances, the driveway, and Mira's bedroom window. The camera footage from the first night was disturbing enough to eliminate any remaining doubt about Captain Whisper's warnings. At 1:17 a.m., a figure in dark clothing approached our house from the street, moving with practiced stealth through our front yard. The person spent 11 minutes examining our windows, testing locks, and taking photographs of our home's layout with a small camera. They paid particular attention to Mira's bedroom window, standing directly beneath it for over 3 minutes, while appearing to take measurements or notes. The figure's face was partially obscured by a hood, but their body language suggested familiarity with surveillance and reconnaissance techniques. They moved like someone with training, avoiding motion sensor lights and staying in shadow whenever possible. At 1:28 a.m., they walked to the blue car with the dented door that Captain Whisper had mentioned, the same vehicle Mira had identified as a bad car. I downloaded the footage immediately and called the police, this time reaching a detective who took the situation significantly more seriously. Detective Raymond Cross arrived at our house within 40 minutes of my call, bringing a forensic technician to process potential evidence. He watched the security footage 3 times, making notes and asking detailed questions about when we'd first noticed suspicious activity. When I mentioned that our 5-year-old daughter's imaginary friend had predicted the surveillance, Detective Cross's expression shifted from professional interest to sharp focus. "Explain exactly what your daughter said and when she said it." I retrieved my notebook and read through Captain Whisper's warnings chronologically, watching Detective Cross's face darken as the list progressed. He asked to speak with Mira directly, and Julia brought her downstairs, still wearing her pajamas. Mira sat on the couch, clutching her stuffed elephant, and answered Detective Cross's gentle questions without hesitation. She explained that Captain Whisper had been warning her about the bad man who wanted to take her away from her family for almost 2 weeks now. The bad man had been planning and watching and waiting for the right time to steal her when nobody was paying attention. Detective Cross asked Mira if Captain Whisper had said anything else about the bad man's plans or identity. She nodded seriously and reported that the bad man worked at a place where children went, which made it easier for him to learn about families and their schedules. He had a special room where he kept pictures of many children, not just her, and he had taken some of the other children already, but nobody had connected the cases yet. Captain Whisper said the bad man was very smart and knew how to avoid being caught because he understood how police investigations worked. He drove different cars and changed his appearance and never stayed in one place long enough for patterns to become obvious. Mira delivered this information calmly, as though relaying simple facts rather than describing a predatory kidnapper. Detective Cross exchanged looks with the forensic technician, who had stopped processing evidence to listen. "Mira, did Captain Whisper tell you where this bad man works?" She thought for a moment, then said Captain Whisper had shown her a building with colorful walls and lots of children's artwork, somewhere parents trusted and visited often without questioning. The description could have matched dozens of locations, but Detective Cross's reaction suggested it had triggered specific recognition. He asked if we'd be willing to have Mira work with a forensic interviewer who specialized in gathering information from child witnesses without leading or traumatizing them. The process would be recorded and conducted at the police station in a child-friendly environment designed to minimize stress. Julia and I agreed immediately, though the situation felt surreal and terrifying. Our daughter's imaginary friend had somehow provided detailed intelligence about an active predator, and law enforcement was taking the warnings seriously enough to bring in specialized investigators. We drove to the station that morning with Mira, who remained cheerful and unconcerned, chatting about Captain Whisper's other observations and asking if we could get pancakes afterward. The disconnect between her innocent demeanor and the horrifying content of her messages was deeply unsettling. The forensic interview lasted 90 minutes with Julia and me, watching through one-way glass, while a trained specialist named Rebecca Thorne gently extracted information from Mira. Rebecca used toys and drawing materials to help Mira communicate Captain Whisper's messages without feeling pressured or scared. Mira drew pictures of the bad man's car, his special room with photographs, and the building where he worked. She described his height, approximate age, and specific mannerisms that Captain Whisper had noticed during surveillance. She mentioned that the bad man wore cologne that smelled like pine trees, and that he had a scar on his left hand shaped like a crescent moon. She said he talked in a soft voice that made children feel safe and special, and he knew exactly how to gain parents' trust by being helpful and friendly. Captain Whisper had watched the bad man approach other families at parks and schools, always targeting children who matched a specific profile that included age, appearance, and family situation. Mira was his current primary target, but he had backup options if she became too difficult to access. Detective Cross joined Julia and me in the observation room halfway through the interview. His expression was grim as he explained that Mira's descriptions matched details from 3 unsolved child abduction cases across 2 counties over the past 14 months. The connection hadn't been obvious because the cases involved different jurisdictions, and the suspect had varied his methods and target selection enough to avoid creating an obvious pattern. But several details Mira had provided through Captain Whisper matched evidence that had never been released publicly, including the pine cologne and the crescent-shaped scar. "We've been looking for this person for over a year," Detective Cross said quietly. "Your daughter's imaginary friend has provided more actionable intelligence than 12 months of investigation. I need to understand how she knows these details." I had no explanation, except that children sometimes noticed things adults overlooked, and Mira had apparently been processing observations through the protective framework of Captain Whisper, without realizing the information's significance. The investigation escalated rapidly after Mira's interview confirmed that her information correlated with active abduction cases. A task force was assembled including detectives from multiple jurisdictions, FBI specialists in crimes against children, and forensic psychologists who could analyze the behavioral patterns Mira had described. The blue car from the security footage was traced to a rental agency that had records of the same vehicle being used during the timeframes of 2 previous abductions. Credit card receipts led investigators to a man named Dr. Kenneth Aldridge, who worked as a developmental psychologist at a children's therapy center serving 3 different school districts. His position gave him access to detailed family information, behavioral assessments, and opportunities to interact with vulnerable children without raising suspicion. Parents trusted him implicitly because of his credentials and institutional affiliation. He used that trust to identify targets, gather intelligence about family routines, and create opportunities for contact that seemed professional and innocent. The investigation into Dr. Aldridge revealed a sophisticated predator who had been operating successfully for years before the recent abduction series. He maintained impeccable professional credentials, positive relationships with colleagues, and a public persona of dedication to children's welfare. His therapy center office was decorated with children's artwork and educational posters, exactly as Mira had described through Captain Whisper. Behind a locked cabinet in his private office, investigators found photography equipment, detailed files on dozens of children, including Mira, and evidence connecting him to 5 child abductions across 4 states dating back 6 years. He'd been using his professional position to access vulnerable families, gain detailed psychological profiles of potential victims, and execute carefully planned kidnappings that left minimal evidence. His training in child psychology made him exceptionally skilled at manipulation and exploitation, understanding exactly how to approach children and families to minimize resistance and maximize trust. The evidence against Dr. Aldridge was overwhelming, but the most damning material came from analysis of his surveillance patterns around our family. He'd been monitoring our household for 3 weeks before Mira started reporting Captain Whisper's warnings, documenting our schedules, identifying security vulnerabilities, and planning an abduction attempt timed to coincide with a school holiday when police resources would be stretched thin. He'd researched my work schedule, Julia's volunteer commitments, and Mira's extracurricular activities, creating detailed timelines that identified optimal windows for kidnapping. His notes indicated he'd selected Mira because she matched his preferred victim profile, and because her family situation suggested she would be compliant and unlikely to resist effectively. He'd prepared a secondary location where he intended to hold her while investigations focused on more obvious suspects, using techniques refined through previous successful abductions. The level of planning and sophistication was absolutely chilling. Detective Cross asked to speak with Mira again, this time focusing on how Captain Whisper had first appeared and why she trusted his warnings. Mira explained that Captain Whisper started talking to her after she noticed the bad man watching her at the library during story time 3 weeks ago. She'd seen him looking at her in a way that felt wrong, and when she got home that night, Captain Whisper had been in her room waiting to warn her. He told her that the bad man was dangerous and that she needed to tell her parents everything she noticed about him and his activities. Captain Whisper taught her to watch for specific signs like the blue car, the cigarette butts, and the surveillance patterns. He helped her remember important details and gave her words to explain things she observed but didn't fully understand. Mira said Captain Whisper was like a guardian who protected children by helping them communicate dangers that adults might dismiss or ignore. She'd trusted him immediately because he never asked her to keep secrets or do anything that felt wrong. The psychological assessment of Mira's Captain Whisper phenomenon suggested she'd created an imaginative framework to process and communicate genuine observations about a real threat. Dr. Vance explained that highly perceptive children sometimes developed protective imaginary companions when faced with situations their developing brains couldn't fully contextualize or articulate. Mira had noticed Dr. Aldridge's predatory attention at the library and had subconsciously recognized his surveillance afterward through environmental cues most adults would miss. Rather than experiencing paralyzing fear, she'd created Captain Whisper as a cognitive tool to organize and communicate her observations in ways that felt safe and manageable. The imaginary friend served as both a protective mechanism and a communication bridge, allowing her to convey detailed warnings without experiencing the full emotional weight of understanding she was being stalked by a kidnapper. It was a remarkable example of childhood resilience and adaptive coping, though the situation that triggered it remained terrifying. Dr. Aldridge was arrested at his therapy center during a regular workday, with police timing the operation to minimize trauma for children in the building. He maintained his innocence initially, claiming the evidence was circumstantial and that his professional research required detailed family documentation that could be misinterpreted by investigators unfamiliar with psychological assessment protocols. His attorney argued that his client was being scapegoated for unsolved crimes because of his access to vulnerable populations, and that no direct evidence linked him to any actual abductions. The defense strategy collapsed when forensic analysis of his vehicle and secondary property revealed DNA evidence from 3 missing children and physical materials matching items taken during documented kidnappings. Confronted with irrefutable proof, Dr. Aldridge's facade crumbled. He became agitated and defensive, alternating between denying everything and claiming his actions were misunderstood expressions of care for children who needed special attention and guidance. The interrogation revealed that Dr. Aldridge had been targeting specific children for over a decade, using his professional position to identify victims who matched his preferences and whose family situations made them vulnerable to his manipulation. He'd developed sophisticated techniques for gaining trust, creating opportunities for access, and executing abductions that left minimal evidence or obvious patterns. His psychological training made him exceptionally dangerous because he understood how to exploit developmental vulnerabilities, manipulate protective instincts, and avoid detection by mimicking normal professional behaviors. He'd successfully abducted and held 8 children over 6 years, with some captivities lasting weeks, before he released them in locations far from their homes. Others had never been recovered. He kept detailed documentation of each case, including photographs, personal items, and psychological assessments, tracking how each child responded to captivity. The evidence suggested he viewed his crimes as longitudinal research rather than criminal acts. The victims who'd been recovered alive provided testimony describing Dr. Aldridge's methods and behaviors during captivity. He'd kept children in soundproofed rooms at properties he owned through shell corporations, maintaining elaborate facades as normal residential locations while hiding imprisonment facilities in basements and converted spaces. He'd used his psychological expertise to break down resistance, create dependency, and prevent escape attempts through manipulation rather than physical restraint. Children described him as initially kind and gentle, gradually becoming more controlling and threatening as captivity extended. He'd taken extensive photographs and videos, creating documentation he claimed was for understanding child development under stress conditions. The testimony painted a picture of a predator who intellectualized his crimes as research while engaging in systematic abuse and exploitation. Several victims had lasting psychological trauma requiring extensive therapy and support. Mira's role in exposing Dr. Aldridge became public knowledge when the case went to trial, with prosecutors calling her as a witness to describe how Captain Whisper had warned her about the defendant's surveillance and plans. The defense attempted to discredit her testimony as fantasy and coached responses, but Rebecca Thorne testified as an expert witness about the consistency and specificity of Mira's initial statements before any investigation had begun. The security footage showed Dr. Aldridge at our house on multiple occasions, corroborating every detail Mira had reported through Captain Whisper. The prosecution argued that Mira's extraordinary perceptiveness had prevented her own abduction and exposed a serial predator who would have continued victimizing children indefinitely. The jury watched her testimony with visible emotion as she calmly explained how Captain Whisper had helped her stay safe by noticing the bad man's surveillance and warning her parents before he could take her away. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with overwhelming evidence against Dr. Aldridge, including DNA, testimony from surviving victims, documentation found at his properties, and the surveillance footage from our home. His defense crumbled under the weight of physical evidence and psychological assessments proving he understood the criminal nature of his actions and had taken elaborate steps to avoid detection. The jury convicted him on all counts, including multiple kidnappings, child endangerment, and attempted abduction. The judge's statement during sentencing was harsh and uncompromising, noting that Dr. Aldridge had exploited his professional position and psychological expertise to perpetrate crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. He received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, ensuring he would never have access to children again. The families of his victims expressed relief and gratitude that he'd finally been stopped, though their children would carry the trauma of their experiences permanently. The aftermath of the case brought unexpected attention to our family, with media coverage focusing on the imaginary friend who'd warned about a real kidnapper. Child safety experts discussed Captain Whisper as an example of how children sometimes communicate danger through indirect means when they lack the vocabulary or understanding to explain threats directly. Psychologists debated whether Mira had genuinely created an imaginary friend or had simply personified her own intuitive threat assessment in ways that felt safer than admitting she was scared. Regardless of the academic interpretation, the practical result had been clear. Mira's warnings had prevented her abduction and exposed a predator who'd evaded law enforcement for years. We declined most interview requests, prioritizing Mira's privacy and emotional well-being over public curiosity about her unusual role in the investigation. Mira continued talking to Captain Whisper occasionally after the trial, though the nature of their conversations changed significantly. Instead of warnings about dangers and surveillance, Captain Whisper now offered comfort and reassurance that she was safe and protected. He appeared less frequently as Mira's anxiety about the traumatic period decreased, gradually fading into occasional companionship rather than constant guardianship. Dr. Vance explained this was normal developmental progression for protective imaginary companions who often diminished as the child's need for the coping mechanism reduced. Mira would likely maintain some connection to Captain Whisper as a positive memory and symbolic protector, but wouldn't require his active presence as she matured and developed more sophisticated understanding of the events she'd experienced. The imaginary friend who'd saved her life was becoming a comforting memory rather than an active protective figure. Julia and I struggled with complicated emotions about the entire experience. Pride that Mira had been perceptive and brave enough to communicate the danger she'd sensed. Guilt that we'd initially dismissed her warnings as childhood fantasy. Terror at how close Dr. Aldridge had come to successfully abducting our daughter. Gratitude that some intuitive or observational gift had allowed Mira to recognize the threat before it materialized into violence. We increased security measures around our home and remained hyper-vigilant about Mira's safety in ways that probably exceeded rational necessity. Dr. Ann Vance helped us process these reactions and develop strategies for supporting Mira's recovery without transferring our anxiety onto her or limiting her normal childhood development. The balance between protection and paranoia required constant calibration as we worked to create an environment where Mira could feel safe without being imprisoned by fear. The other victims' families reached out to us, expressing gratitude that Mira's warnings had stopped Dr. Aldridge before he could hurt more children. Several of them had daughters who were on his target list, identified through documentation found at his properties. Meeting these families reinforced how close we'd come to losing Mira and how many other children had suffered because Dr. Aldridge had operated undetected for so long. The connections we made with other families became an unexpected support system as we navigated the aftermath of the case and helped our children process the trauma of knowing they'd been targeted. Some of the older children who'd been held captive by Dr. Aldridge met Mira and thanked her for being brave enough to listen to Captain Whisper's warnings. Those conversations were emotionally overwhelming, but also healing, creating connections between survivors and reinforcing that good had ultimately emerged from the horrifying situation. Years later, Mira still occasionally mentioned Captain Whisper, though now with the awareness that he'd been her way of processing and communicating real danger. She understood on some level that she'd created him as a protective mechanism. But she also maintained that he'd been real in the ways that mattered, helping her stay safe when nobody else recognized the threat. Whether Captain Whisper represented pure imagination, intuitive threat assessment, or something less easily categorized remained debatable. What mattered was that he'd given Mira the framework to communicate observations that saved her life and exposed a predator who'd successfully hidden behind professional credentials and institutional trust. The imaginary friend who wasn't entirely imaginary had proven more effective than conventional security measures or adult vigilance, demonstrating that children's unconventional communication sometimes deserved serious attention rather than dismissal. Dr. Aldridge died in prison 18 months into his sentence, attacked by inmates who'd learned about his crimes against children. The violence that ended his life was brutal and swift, carried out by prisoners who viewed predators as deserving neither protection nor mercy. I felt no satisfaction in his death, only a complicated relief that he could never hurt another child. The families of his victims expressed similar mixed reactions, acknowledging that prison justice had delivered a finality the legal system couldn't provide, while recognizing that violence remained violence regardless of the target. Mira asked about Dr. Aldridge's death when she overheard Julia and me discussing it, and I struggled to explain that bad people sometimes faced consequences from other bad people. She thought about that for a moment, then said Captain Whisper had told her the bad man wouldn't hurt anyone anymore. It was the last time she mentioned her imaginary friend in present tense, marking the end of his active presence in her life. Today, Mira is 11 years old and thriving, despite the trauma she experienced. She's become an advocate for children's safety education, speaking at schools about trusting intuition and communicating uncomfortable feelings to adults who will listen. She frames her experience with Captain Whisper as learning to listen to the voice inside that warns when something feels wrong, encouraging other children to develop their own internal guardians who help them recognize danger. The work gives her purpose and transforms her frightening experience into tools for protecting others. Julia and I support her advocacy while monitoring carefully for signs that she's processing trauma through activism rather than genuinely healing. Dr. Vance assures us that Mira's resilience and desire to help others indicates healthy coping rather than avoidance, though we remain vigilant about her emotional well-being. The daughter whose imaginary friend warned us about a real kidnapper grew into a young woman who warns others about real dangers, using her voice to protect children who might otherwise suffer silently. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.